Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play The Guardian Legend. In the last part we went through areas 7 and 8, and now it's time for our final theme of levels in the, I guess, deep cave strata type look in areas 9 and 10. I guess technically the previous cave area was more like a gem kind of cave, like geodes and all that, whereas this is just a proper cave. Now, there are two particular things that the last two areas in the game I think are pretty guilty of. Before we cover what those are in detail, albeit that last room is an example of one of them, let's check out this room. Seal 9 can be removed by standing on the gate. Well, that makes it a very ineffective lock now, doesn't it? So the two things that I think the last two areas of the game are very guilty of is, for one thing, enemy spam. There's a lot of rooms where if they have enemies at all, they're going to just spam effectively every level of a given enemy at you at once. And that can get a little overwhelming, even if they don't take a lot to get through. Although they also have those soldier enemies that run down and spawn little slimes, but they're not a lot to worry about. But the thing they're particularly guilty of is throwing a lot of items at you you're probably no longer going to need if you've gotten everything up to this point. This is technically a 100% LP, barring the score-related HP tallies, yes. But there's a lot of items you don't need to pick up in areas 9 and 10. Because you already have them at max. For instance, this area alone has 2 defense upgrades. Remember, with what we've grabbed thus far, we maxed out back at area 7. Now, I'm not saying them putting them here, the extras in, is a bad thing. If anything, that's good, because that means you can ignore certain areas earlier on in the case you don't like the combat scenarios and all that to get them later. Or vice versa, you can get them earlier if you know where to go get them as soon as you can. But it definitely does lead to pickups in the later 2 areas if you grab everything along the way. Feeling a little underwhelming, because at this point, if you've gotten everything, most of your weapons are maxed out, your HP is really high, your defense is maxed, your gun is really strong, not maxed, the last one's in Area 10, and actually I should correct something, I probably already put text up saying it. The previous key we got does actually not allow us access to Area 10, it's only Area 9. I completely forgot Area 9 has its own key that we need to obtain within the plot corridor here. And that's because, frankly, despite this game being a giant dungeon crawler when it's not a shoot-'em-up section, the map is so clearly marked on where you should go next that keys for earlier areas not allowing you to access later areas never really comes into being a problem. If you're not paying attention to the map as much, maybe that's not so much an issue, but even on my first playthrough, I was like, alright, I got this, it allows me to go over there, so let's go over there. Biggest enemy of note around here, by the way, is the dinosaur skulls that fly at you from the skeletons. They're kind of fast and do fire a lot of projectiles at you, and from memory, I think their biggest trouble is that they actually do a pretty decent chunk of contact damage. But because of the current width of our blaster on top of its strength and our sub-weapons, they don't really get much of a chance to do that. Boss of Corridor 19 is a little bit familiar, and something we haven't seen in a little bit, though. It's time for another bombarder, so it's once again the enemy that just teleports all over the place, fires some homing missiles, teleports out. I do think this particular boss just has a damage limit on how much you can do before it teleports away, though. Mind you, that might just depend on the 8-frame rule we were talking about earlier when it comes to how sub-weapons do damage. The slightly annoying thing about the enemy, I guess, is that since it can teleport all over the screen, only certain weapons can reach it at certain points, like the backfire can reach it once at the very bottom of the screen pretty much exclusively, or the bullet shield. But with the amount of damage you're going to be doing with whatever sub-weapons you're deciding to use on it at this point anyway, it doesn't exactly last long enough to be a problem. On top of the fact, its projectiles don't really do a lot of damage to begin with, as you can see. That, I guess, is a bit of a weird thing with the game. Boss pacing is all over the place, where you occasionally get things like the green Optimon all the way back at Corridor 11 that is way too early for the amount of damage it does for the amount of defense you have at that point. But then here we are this late in the game finding something like that that doesn't really put up much of a threat anymore. This is an example of what I was talking about earlier, though. The reward for Corridor 19 is a defense upgrade. We're already at max. This does theoretically mean you can ignore some earlier ones to come over here later, but you might want to have the higher defense for the Grimgrins or other bosses we've already fought at this point, so there's not much reason to. I guess the thing could be you might not be checking every single room on a first playthrough in any given area. But given how fast moving in this game already is, even without the defense level that boosts your speed, you're probably going to be checking enough rooms along the way that you're probably going to have enough defense at this point to be either max, or maybe that one there will be the max, so it just feels a little overkill with the amount of copies of a power-up there are, I guess is the way I should parse it. Although actually, on that note, I forgot to state this earlier. There is another change that happens with the defense upgrades, in that I think around level 3 defense, some enemy spawns change in Area 0. But given how most of your time in Area 0 is going to be spent moving from one area to the next anyway, you're probably not going to get a chance to really see it a lot. It's an interesting idea that maybe Area 0 could have gotten more upgrades the further into the game you got to make it more of a marathon to get through. Like maybe every time you beat an area, an enemy from it will start spawning on one of the screens in there, like the blue spiders that turn red and then multiply could have spawned in one of the rooms moving forward, or all that kind of jazz. Maybe the soldiers from here would spawn when you beat Area 9, I guess Corridor 9. Things like that, but they don't exactly ever do that. This game, I think, is honestly really intriguing in that angle where, for what it is, it's actually very competent for a lot of NES game standards. But there's a lot of minor things that could go with another go that even just a sequel could have potentially fixed. Also, like that one room said, just stand on the gate to Corridor 9 and it opens up. Mind you, I guess thinking about it though, because of the whole situation with Compile dissolving like I've already mentioned, I'm imagining the IP for this game could potentially be a nightmare to work with, because I'm assuming, considering I know Gardic was in specific, I wouldn't be surprised if D4 Enterprises is the one that currently owns this IP, and even though I think they do have an agreement worked out with Compile Heart to have access to some of Compile's original IPs, I imagine not every single one of them was included in that, including games like this. Something I actually didn't cover back when I talked about that. D4 Enterprises, they're the company that bought a lot of the other Compile properties from Compile, excluding Puyo-Puyo, because that's owned by Sega nowadays. They're responsible for porting a lot of games to newer systems. Like, they were, I think, one of the main developers on the Chrono Cross re-release that came out, I think back in 2022 or so. I think the Pico project is them in general. I think the PC version of FF8 from the early 2010s is them. But they're also the main people behind the Egg console, which is a digital distribution service for a lot of retro games that were on older PCs. You can actually pick some of those up on the Nintendo Switch Online store, for instance. It's how you can play the Japanese versions of the original PC 88 releases of, like, Dragon Slayer Legend of Heroes and Ys 1 and 2. They're Japanese language, although I think the console itself, like the emulation deck they're on, so to speak, on the digital download, does have English UI elements, I want to say. Which, hey, that's pretty neat. I actually really like that that's happening, because I feel like not a lot of developers do a good job of keeping their older games released on modern platforms. So the boss of Corridor 9 here is an Igor. This is one of my favorite bosses to use grenades on, because it's one of the few times where that huge explosion radius really comes in handy. The Igor itself stays in the middle of the screen, moving up and down, firing lasers all over the center of the bottom of the screen. Meanwhile, it's firing skulls out that track onto you very well and very quickly. Thus, the grenade, we just throw it to the right or left, depending which side you're on, and hope that you hit everything along the way. The grenade is the highest damage weapon, like we've said, although it doesn't do as many hits, technically, as a fireball theoretically can, in the optimal situation. But it's such a good offensive and defensive upgrade for option for this fight, rather, that it's really what you should use. For beating this boss, though, we're going to, of course, get the key that allow us to access Area 10 up in the top center of Area 0. But also, we're going to get our second-to-last main weapon upgrade. It's going to upgrade the Area Blaster sub-weapon in specific. And this is kind of a nuts upgrade. So the Area Blaster, one of the earliest sub-weapons we got, it started at 1 chip per second. And then it went to 8 chips per second. At level 3, it costs 120 chips per second. With that said, it does incredibly increase the efficiency of the weapon in terms of how fast it delivers damage to enemies it goes through it, to the point where it's almost as good at destroying main enemies during the shoot-'em-up sections as the enemy eraser. It just costs chips. The danger of that is it costs chips so it can make your blaster less efficient overall, because as we've seen, since we're at the max of 4,000 chips now, which I forgot to mention before, our blaster is wider than the Guardian themselves now, to a point of using that in the fireball should take care of most things along the way. One more sub-weapon to get to max strength, though. Thankfully, the upgrade for it is pretty close by, because Corridor 19 has 3 exits, and directly north of the exit to the east is another mini-boss that's going to drop the final sub-weapon upgrade. This mini-boss in specific is another one of these robots. This one moves incredibly fast, though, so it's dangerous for just losing your HP on contact damage alone. Thankfully, it doesn't have a lot of health. So for that, we got ourselves the final wave attack upgrade, and every supplement that can be upgraded is now fully upgraded. Also over here is another defense upgrade that we don't need. The main reason that I'm still grabbing some of these redundant upgrades is, for one thing, 100% technically would require me to do that, even if I'm not getting all the score-based upgrades. But also, they do, like I mentioned last time, heal you slightly. So in case you're lower on HP, grabbing them can still be helpful. So the fully upgraded wave attack goes from costing 7 chips per second to 20 chips per second. But its damage triples from 2 to 6 per hit. It's effectively a constant stream of waves that are fully circular, fired ahead of you, that can destroy bullets. It's really good for area coverage and keeping a straight line safe ahead of you, but there's overall just better choices for my playstyle, at least in terms of both defense and offensive play. Corridor 20 is right there, which is the last optional one, but notably there is also a shop here that is absurdly expensive, and we already have all those upgrades, so it's not really worth it. I mean, I guess if you ignored certain things earlier, it could be nice, but the 2,000 chip hit you would take going into Corridor 20 to, like, even just do a full health restore with that energy tank just doesn't really feel worth it. Now, barring my definition of 100% at least, and score reasons, Corridor 19 back in Area 9 wasn't exactly that worth doing. You absolutely should do Corridor 20 just to help maximize your survivability in the endgame areas, though, because our reward here is actually worth it. They definitely throw a lot at you, though, between the smaller enemies firing projectiles from all angles of the screen while the tiny soldier guys jump on the bottom of the screen firing lasers downwards. This is a very good example of what I was talking about earlier, where they just like to crowd the screen in some of the later areas. But again, enemy erasers do a good job of just nullifying any threats. And since at this point you probably have over 100 saved up, you could use them and you probably will not run out throughout the rest of the game, easily. At least if you don't just rely on using them during boss fights as well. That's, I guess, a potential hang-up there. Not that you really should. I'm not even sure if the enemy erasers technically do damage to boss fights. If they do, it's probably like a minimal amount that your base start of game blaster could easily outpace, honestly. So, just to fill the time, last time I talked briefly about there being a special password in the game I haven't talked about yet. What that password is depends on whether or not you're playing the US release or the Japanese release. In the Japanese release, the password is TGL. You get this upon beating the game, effectively. In the Japanese version, it is ALG, which just sounds like ALG. That triggers what's known as Corridor Rush Mode. Corridor Rush Mode turns the game from a dual-genre, interesting, little quirky game into just a straight-up shoot-'em-up. It removes all the dungeon crawling as the Guardian and just makes you go through every single one of the main corridors in the order you encounter them in the game. So it's like 0, 1, 11, 12, 2, 13, 3, 14, 4, 15, 5, 16, 6, 17, 7, 18, 8, 19, 9, 20, 10, and then 21, which is where we're going to encounter the final boss. The reason I'm not showing it off? Frankly, it's a marathon, and I don't really enjoy playing it, because the reason I enjoy this game is the mixture of the two styles, rather than one gameplay style being better than the other, if that makes sense. Boss of Corridor 20, by the way, is another Clawbot. This one moves very fast, but you can drain its HP very quickly. Just be careful, because when it loses its claws, its firing rate is, frankly, impossible to get through without getting hit, probably, unless you intentionally take a hit from one of the smaller projectiles and then quickly get out of dodge. For clearing Corridor 20, we get the most worthwhile upgrade from one of these in a while, the final gun upgrade. So now our gun will do 5 damage per shot, making it really good, to say the least. Corridor Rush does have a bit of a unique quirk to it, though, in how it handles power-ups. In that, since the dungeon crawling segments have been removed, they still have to give you power-ups, otherwise late-game boss fights would just obliterate you in a single breath. The way they handle it is that it's tied to points. By the way, a bit of a unique mini-boss here. Remember that skull from the previous stage's corridors? Here's one as a mini-boss. It moves in a sort of a weird ellipse across parts of the stage and fires projectiles that are pretty fast at you. It moves fast, but you can outpace its damage pretty quickly. Effectively, the way Corridor Rush works is that you get a power-up when you beat a stage for every 10,000 points you got in that stage. But you can only get 5 power-ups per stage. And the thing is, you get a Rapid Up, the multi-bullets, and a blue and red lander for clearing the first stage, area 0, Corridor 0, no matter what. So your goal is to get 10,000 points equivalently roughly every level. For instance, at 10,000 points, you get the first wave attack and bullet shield upgrade. 20k gets you the first saber cutter, grenade, and back wave abilities. 30,000 points gives you the first repeller upgrade. 40,000 will give you a red lander. 50,000 gives you a blue lander. 60,000 gives you a area attack. And then it just continues to go down until that score eventually maxes out at 800,000. Keep firing. The last seal will be removed. So to open Corridor 10, fire in the room Corridor 10 zone until it opens up. So there is strategy to the Corridor Rush mode. It's just not very engaging because it's effectively just a marathon of things you've already done unless you knew about that password ahead of time. As an example of what a marathon Corridor Rush is, though, there is a long play of this game on YouTube that's just under 5 hours long on the World of Long Plays channel. Played by, I think it's pronounced Rank, one of those two. The final boss of the main campaign is beaten at about the 3.5 hour mark. The remaining just over an hour is entirely Corridor Rush. So that means roughly in this game, you're playing as the top-down dungeon crawling guardian for about 2 hours or so, whereas the corridors are about an hour long, considering the relatively consistent speed of them. A fact that's even actually reflected in the speedruns for the game, because there are 3 categories for the speedruns for this. 100%, TGL mode, so Corridor Rush, and any percent. TGL mode, so Corridor Rush, is 52 minutes long, about 53 actually on the world record. Any percent is 49 minutes. 100% is only an hour and 16, so they do a lot of stuff to just skip the top-down dungeon crawling stuff more often than not, and just do the auto-scrolling shoot-'em-up sections, which is a majority of the game's length at that point, which there's something about that I find kind of funny, honestly. This is a bit of a funny mini-boss. Hey, I remember this thing from one of the shoot-'em-up sections. Now it's a mini-boss to fight in the dungeon crawling. Honestly, it's easier because you can approach it from any angle to shoot it rather than just, like, in front or below. I guess you can also hit it from the sides with the saber cutters in the shoot-'em-up sections. It's a lot faster to do it with the fireball in this particular fight, as you can see, although our upgrades definitely help with that. We're already approaching the end of Area 10 itself, though. Enter this room, and time for Corridor 10. To open it up, we need to fire anywhere in the room. As long as you're holding down that B button for about 10 seconds, the corridor itself will open. Corridor 10 is weird. It's the last standard corridor we're doing in the game by a lot of definitions, because they definitely throw the most enemies at you in this one compared to any of the other ones, it feels like. But as long as you've gotten a good stock of enemy erasers, there's not a lot to worry about here. Heck, I'd say technically the boss fight here isn't even that bad. As generally, I think the boss type we encounter here that we've already seen, or maybe already in the LP, is easier than, say, a Grim Grin because of how much is on screen comparatively. Yeah, the damage is high up there. But you can just kind of melt through it with grenades or anything else you got at this point, really. Now, I also want to say, this could be potentially the longest standard corridor in the game, but I can't tell if that's just because of the amount of enemies they're throwing at me, or the HP of the boss that makes me think that. As, the thing with shoot-'em-ups is, sometimes you don't notice how short or long stages can be because of how much they're throwing at you when you're just in the moment with all the adrenaline and all that. It's one of those things you notice it only really when looking at someone else mess around with it that you seem to notice the length. I am glad this game has the visual variety it does, though, for both enemy and visual layouts of the shoot-'em-up sections, though, because if you were going through the exact same aesthetic for every level, it definitely would get a little tiring to look at. Even if they only swap every 2 main areas, that means there's effectively, like, 4 shoot-'em-up sections per level aesthetic. I think is a fine amount, honestly, especially given the length of the ones there are overall. You're not spending too long in a given aesthetic, and I feel like in some games that's something that's kind of underappreciated. It's part of why I think Battle Network 1 feels so rough to play in a lot of regards, is there's not that slight visual flavor that changes, even if it's like the color shift that happens in the later main Battle Networks, rather than just a complete visual overhaul. Those minor details matter a lot for making an adventure feel like it's progressing, I find. Also, these skull enemies here, they let out skulls. They don't really stand that much of a threat. If anything, they're a really good restock point for chips if you're using a lot of higher-powered sub-weapons. Alright, so the boss of Corridor 10 is a red Igor. Although it starts off green, and it turns red. This one, instead of firing out skulls, fires out nails. The nails do a lot more damage than the lasers, though, I should note. Apparently, the lasers technically only do 1 damage per frame they'll actually be damaging you, which isn't a lot, but I guess it builds up. Tanking to the sides is still overall the safer option, though, especially if you're throwing grenades towards it, as that'll destroy the nails before they really have a chance to get over to you, really. Notably, for beating this boss, we don't actually get a key. Effectively, what the game checks for you to access the endgame corridor is whether or not, I believe, corridors 1 through 10 in specific have been cleared, maybe 0 through 10. 11 through 20 are completely optional, they're just there for you to get power-ups, and you probably should do them all the same, just to make your other corridors a little bit easier. Although we do technically get an item for beating this particular corridor, a set of enemy erasers. Honestly, I feel like they maybe should have swapped the corridor earlier on in the game. I think it was in like Area 3 that gives us an energy tank for here, so to speak, in terms of the reward, because I feel like getting an energy tank after this boss fight would be a lot more useful for getting out of Area 10 than a single set of 20 enemy erasers. Albeit, hey, they still work as the walking guardian, it's just they feel a lot less effective as your gun can reach so far, so quickly in all 8 directions that it's not as useful. On top of the fact that you have that combined with the fireball, which is just absurd. As for the location of the final corridor in the game, once we finish Area 10 here, it's back in Area 0, and I think you could have found it earlier in the game, you just couldn't access it until the corridors numbered 1 through 10 are completed. In specific, it is, I think, like 2 rooms left, west, and 1 room north of the center point of Area 0 that we first entered after Corridor 0. That does mean we once again have to backtrack out here, and this is why I really think they should have given you an energy tank here, just to top up your health in case you got really low in that particular area, but oh well. Thanks to the power speed up, we'll get out of here pretty quickly. Yeah, there it is, right about there. So, things to do once we're on the way out of Area 10. For one thing, you should stop by whatever blue landers along the way to actually get a new password updated, just so you actually have a password. On top of that, you can write it down just for endgame in case you want to refight the final boss again and again and again if you wanted to for some reason. But also make sure you stop off at that one screen to chop off your chips or health in the case you're low. So, the rest of this video is a little awkward, I won't lie. You see, I wrapped up this video, rendered it out and everything, then loaded up the next video to commentate. 9 minutes long. I had meant to rebalance some things here and there in the earlier parts in order to make the game end at roughly 20 minutes per video. I forgot to do that and had already commentated the entire LP up to this point. Whoops. So we're just pasting that last 9 minutes onto here. Hey, everyone. Welcome back, I guess. Whoopsie. So if I've talked about in this LP up to this point, this being a 7-part long LP, technically that's true. It is no longer true. So Corridor 21 here is the final level. It is a boss rush of sorts. You don't fight every boss in the game. In fact, some of these bosses we only technically fought once. You fight a blue Fleepa, a red Zibzub, a blue Clawbot, a red Optimon, a Grimgrin, the blue Grimgrin specific, and a red Bombarder, all in a row here. That is a lot on one health bar, but for one thing, the constantly raining down meteorites can give you some health. But also, because some of these are the lower strength variations of some of these bosses we've already fought, your fully upgraded arsenal at this point will just melt through their health. So don't worry too much about it. Now, if there is one thing that I immediately benefit from due to that unexpected quote-unquote setback, I'm rejuvenated. Since I'm so several hours removed from the previous set of recording sessions, I just feel great. The unfortunate thing is sometimes with the way I just structure my LPs, sometimes the final part is shorter to begin with. But 9 minutes is so short, I don't feel comfortable doing that as its own separate video. My lower limit for that is like 12 to 13 minutes, and even that depends on the structure of the game to begin with. A lot of times in cases like this, if a game would be like a 20-minute part and a 10-minute part, I would usually just make that a 30-minute part. That's why the entire Let's Play One-Offs playlist technically exists nowadays in my eyes. Other than that, or it's a game that I just felt fit better in a single video, hence the Mega Man World games and all that. This is just a case of me forgetting to do it because of how I structure my LPs nowadays, admittedly behind the scenes. I think I've talked about this roughly before. I like to do my LPs in groups of 3 in some form. So like this, Wario Land, and Resident Evil 0 were all recorded in a row, and then edited one at a time, and then uploaded one at a time. So I will do the next group of 3 LPs, recording, batch from there, then editing, batch from there, then commentary, batch from there. And that does lead to some of the cases where I forget what I'm talking about with the games at some points, but usually I remember well enough because I compartmentalize them in those groups of 3 that it works for the most part, but because of the subtitling process for Resident Evil 0's campaign, I did completely forget about that. Whoops. Either way, this boss rush isn't a lot to write home about. I almost sped this up to kind of be in lieu with a lot of the other LPs I do with boss rushes, but because some of these are technically, I think, variants of these bosses we haven't seen before, I decided not to. Either that or I was leaving that to future me to go back, rebalance the previous parts, and then speed this up to see if that would have worked. I don't remember at this point. The rare casualty of how I structure my LPs strikes seldomly, but noticeably. With that said, once you're done with the Bombarder, this boss rush is over. And thankfully, with our fully powered up arsenal, it doesn't last long. Just make sure you're topped up on health from meteorites if you need to be before you actually finish off the boss fight. Call it a hunch. You're gonna want that health. So Naju has been destroyed, the threat to Earth has been removed, but the game's not done yet. In the lieu of various Capcom and Mega Man games, that boss rush is just the precursor to the real final boss. And they do give you a quick little section of a level here with meteorites to restock your health in case you didn't in the boss rush itself. But frankly, no matter how well stocked you are, this thing can kill you pretty quickly. To my knowledge, this final boss doesn't have a name. Any resources I've seen, like Strategy Wiki and all that, just call this thing It. It only has 3 notable attacks while it's bouncing left and right. It can shove its claws forward, which does a lot of damage. It's got tiny little bubbles it pukes out, which do absurd damage for their size, and it has homing missiles. You need to hit it in its eye to damage it, and this thing has a lot of health, according to the Admiral thread on GameFAQs. This thing has over 2,000 health, 2176 in specific. There are a couple of methods you could use to take this thing out that are pretty reliable. Grenades do a lot of damage, and because they're a large hitbox, that does a lot. Fireball is really good here as well, but because of the claws, they're not exactly reliable without being high risk. The fastest way of doing damage in this fight is by using the Area Blaster, as it allows you to move freely around the area and dodge anything and hit the missiles, while having a constant stream of damage on it. You do train through your chip pretty quickly, but with the chips that can drop from the things around you on top of everything else is the most reliable way. Side waves or the side cutters can also do pretty well here, but this is my preferred method of doing it from my various playthroughs of the game. It's rough, it's got a lot of health, and it's a resource drainer. I basically always end that fight at pretty low health, but at the end of the day, if you got this far, you'll beat that eventually. Mission complete. That's the Guardian Legend. I really like this game. I think it's a really interesting and for the time, innovative mix of 2 genres you don't really see mixed a lot. To the point where I'm actually really sad we haven't seen a modern reinvention, spiritual successor, or remake of this, barring that weird fan remake that's in English and Russian that I brought up earlier in the LP that I still haven't played. I guess the big thing, like I mentioned earlier, is that the rights for this game are probably in just a weird limbo due to Compile's closing, and even though Compile Heart has access to some IPs through D4 Enterprises, as I've mentioned, this probably isn't in the games they immediately want to go and redo or revisit in some form, because there's probably other shoot-'em-ups that are just better suited or more beloved to do that to. I think it's an underrated gem on the NES overall, though. And hey, like I mentioned, for an underrated NES gem, loose carts of it are relatively inexpensive at the moment. But who knows when that could get changed. I'd say it's worth a try if you want to play it. If you don't like the dungeon crawling stuff, the corridor rush mode that I mentioned is there, even though I'm not touching it for this LP. There's some pretty cool stuff here. The roughest thing I think with it is that its difficulty curve can sometimes be a little all over the place between things like the green Optimon early on just doing ridiculous damage for the amount of health and defense you have. But there are ways around some of that because you can enter some areas quickly, leave them, and then go to other areas to get more upgrades and then do all that. Sometimes things like that are more a consequence of me wanting to go through things in the numerical order they're presented. That's how they tell you the password in order to access Corridor Rush, by the way. And from here, the game just hangs on this screen. You can reset the console, do whatever you want and all that, but with that, I'm gonna need to end this LP off here. Thank you guys for watching, have a great night, take care, and I'll see you guys next Let's Play, whatever that may be. See you guys then.